My brother stole my inheritance, disappeared for 6 years, and now he wants me to save him. Growing up, it was just the three of us, Mom, Jake, and me. Dad passed away when I was only 8, and Jake was 12. His sudden death from a heart attack left us reeling. He wasn't just the glue holding our family together. He was our provider, our rock. Mom, though loving and devoted, struggled to fill the void he left behind. Dad wasn't wealthy by any stretch, but he'd planned well. He'd left behind a modest inheritance, not enough to make us rich, but enough to give both Jake and me a shot at a brighter future. The funds were to be held in trust until each of us turned 18. Mom explained it to us when we were kids. Your dad wanted to make sure you both could go to college, or start a business, or whatever you needed to make something of yourselves. At the time, I didn't fully grasp the importance of what she was saying, but I remember Jake's reaction vividly. He scoffed. What's the point? Dad's gone. Money won't change that. Even then, he had a defiance about him, a chip on his shoulder that only seemed to grow as the years went on. Mom worked tirelessly to keep us afloat, juggling shifts at the local diner and freelancing as a seamstress. I admired her strength, though I could see the toll it took on her. She was always tired, her hands rough from long hours of labor. Jake, on the other hand, seemed to grow more restless. He started hanging out with an older crowd, kids who'd cut class and smoke behind the school gym. I was too young to understand the full scope of what he was getting into, but I knew it worried Mom. He's grieving in his own way, she'd say, trying to justify his behavior. But as Jake's rebellious streak worsened, even her patience began to wear thin. By the time Jake turned 18, things were tense between him and Mom. He'd barely graduated high school and had no concrete plans for his future. Still, when he accessed his inheritance, Mom held out hope that he'd use it wisely. Maybe he'll surprise us, she said, more to herself than to me. But Jake didn't surprise us, at least, not in a good way. Within months, the money was gone. He'd blown through it on a used sports car, flashy clothes, and endless nights out with his friends. By the time he'd realized how badly he'd messed up, it was too late. The money was spent, and Jake had nothing to show for it except a stack of speeding tickets and a group of friends who disappeared as quickly as the cash. When I turned 18, I was determined not to follow in his footsteps. I'd always been the quieter, more studious one, and I'd worked hard to earn a scholarship to a nearby college. The inheritance Dad left for me was supposed to cover the rest of my tuition and give me a head start in life. But when I approached Mom about accessing the funds, her face went pale. She hesitated, her hands trembling as she held her coffee mug. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you." My stomach tightened. "What is it?" "The money, it's gone." I stared at her, uncomprehending. "What do you mean, gone?" "You've been saving it for me, right?" Tears welled up in her eyes as she explained. Jake had taken it. When he was 22, he'd somehow convinced her to show him the paperwork for both of our accounts. He'd forged her signature and withdrawn every cent from my fund. By the time she'd realized what he'd done, he'd already left town. "Gone where?" I demanded, my voice shaking. She shook her head. "I don't know. He said he needed a fresh start, that he'd pay it back eventually, but I haven't heard from him since." I sat there, stunned. My brother, the person I'd looked up to for most of my childhood, had stolen my future and disappeared without a word. The years that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Without the inheritance, I was left scrambling to figure out how to pay for college. The scholarship helped, but it didn't cover everything. I took out loans to make up the difference and to keep afloat. I worked 2 part-time jobs, stocking shelves at a grocery store in the mornings and bartending at night. Sleep became a luxury I couldn't afford. My grades slipped, not because I wasn't trying, but because I was constantly exhausted. While my classmates spent weekends partying or traveling, I was flipping burgers or wiping down sticky counters. Every time I thought about Jake, his betrayal, his selfishness, it felt like a punch to the gut. Mom tried to help where she could. She'd slip me a $20 bill here and there, or pack me leftovers when I visited, but the guilt weighed heavily on her. She'd bring up Jake in hushed tones, always hopeful that he'd come back and make things right. "He's just lost," she'd say, over and over, as if repeating it would make it true. He'll find his way back. Meanwhile, I buried myself in work and school, determined not to let his actions define my future. But it was a lonely, grueling existence. Friends drifted away as I prioritized survival over socializing. I spent more nights crying in my car than I cared to admit, overwhelmed by the weight of it all. Occasionally, we'd hear vague rumors about Jake. A family friend claimed to have spotted him in Los Angeles, working at a bar. Another said he'd moved to Las Vegas and was hanging out with a sketchy crowd. None of it was ever confirmed, and I stopped asking. As far as I was concerned, Jake was a ghost. 6 years passed. By the time I turned 24, I'd managed to claw my way to a semblance of stability. I'd graduated college, though not without a mountain of debt, and landed an entry-level job in marketing. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I'd even managed to save a little, though most of it went toward chipping away at my student loans. Then, one night, everything changed. I was heading home from work when Mom called. Her voice was trembling. "Honey," she said, "I need to tell you something. It's about Jake." My stomach dropped. "What about him?" "He's back in town," she said, her words hesitant. "He called me. Said he wanted to reconnect." I gripped the phone tighter, my emotions a whirlwind of anger, disbelief, and something I couldn't quite name. "What does he want?" "He's in trouble," she admitted. "But he says he's trying to turn his life around. He wants to see you." "You've got to be kidding me," I snapped. "After everything he's done, he thinks he can just waltz back into our lives?" "He's still your brother," Mom said, her voice pleading. "Please, just hear him out." For me, against my better judgment, I agreed to meet him. The next evening, I found myself sitting in a booth at the local diner, my leg bouncing nervously under the table. I'd barely touched my coffee, my stomach churning with anxiety. When Jake walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. He'd lost weight, his once broad shoulders now slouched. His clothes hung awkwardly on him, and his face was gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes. He looked like a man who'd been through hell, and maybe he had. "Hey," he said, sliding into the booth across from me. I didn't respond right away, just stared at him, trying to reconcile this hollowed-out version of my brother with the larger-than-life figure I'd once idolized. Finally, I spoke. "What do you want, Jake?" He sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "I need help." Jake's words hung in the air like a bad smell. I leaned back in my seat, crossing my arms. "Help? You've got to be kidding me." He flinched at the edge in my voice, but pressed on. "I know I don't deserve it, okay? But I'm out of options." I scoffed. "That's rich. You're out of options now, but 6 years ago, you didn't think twice about leaving us to clean up your mess." "I was stupid back then," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the table. "I made a lot of mistakes." "Mistakes?" My voice rose before I could stop it. "Jake, you stole my inheritance, my chance to go to college without drowning in debt. You didn't just screw up, you torched your family." His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in his expression. "I know, okay? I know what I did was wrong. I was desperate and scared. I thought if I had the money, I could start over, make something of myself. And how'd that work out for you?" I shot back, unable to hide the venom in my tone. Jake didn't answer right away. Instead, he rubbed his face, looking older than his 32 years. "Not great," he admitted finally. "I used the money to move to LA, tried to start a business with some friends, but it all fell apart. Then I got caught up with gambling. One bad bet turned into 10, and well, you can guess the rest." I shook my head, barely able to process what I was hearing. "So you blew through the money, racked up debt, and now what? You think I'm going to bail you out?" He winced but didn't deny it. "I don't expect you to hand me cash. I need a loan to get back on my feet. Enough to pay off some of the debt and get the collectors off my back." My jaw dropped. "A loan? After everything you've done, you think I'd even consider that?" "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "I've hit rock bottom, man. I'm trying to turn things around. I'm going to meetings, looking for steady work. But I need a little help to get out of this hole." I stared at him, my chest tight with a mix of anger and something more complicated. Part of me wanted to tell him to shove it, to remind him of every sleepless night I'd spent worrying about how to pay for school, every job I juggled just to stay afloat. But another part of me saw the broken man in front of me, the same brother who used to carry me on his shoulders, who made me laugh until I cried. It was infuriating how much of that Jake I still remembered, even now. "Why should I trust you?" I asked finally, my voice cold. "You don't have to trust me," he said quietly. "Just believe that I want to do better. For Mom, if not for me. She's been through enough because of me." Bringing up Mom was a low blow, and we both knew it. She'd spent years hoping he'd come back, and now that he had, he was playing on her guilt. I stood abruptly, grabbing my jacket. "I need time to think about this." Jake looked up, his face hopeful and wary all at once. "That's all I'm asking. Just think about it." I left the diner feeling more conflicted than ever. I hated that he still had the power to mess with my head, even after everything he'd done. 4 days after meeting Jake, I couldn't get him out of my head. Anger, pity, and a twisted sense of obligation wrestled for control. I found myself replaying every memory of him, both the good and the bad. It didn't help that Mom kept calling, urging me to be the bigger person and give Jake a chance. "Mom," I said during one of our conversations, "he stole from me, from us. And now he wants me to just hand him more money?" "He's trying, sweetheart," she said softly. "He knows he messed up, but he's family. Family forgives." I hung up feeling drained. Mom's capacity for forgiveness was boundless, but mine wasn't. Still, something inside me needed closure, one way or another. So, I called Jake and told him to meet me at my apartment that Saturday. When he arrived, I could tell he was nervous. He stood in the doorway, shifting his weight from foot to foot, holding a battered duffel bag that looked like it had seen better days. I waved him in and motioned for him to sit on the couch while I grabbed us drinks. "Thanks for seeing me," he said, his voice tentative. "Don't thank me yet," I replied, setting the drinks down. "We need to talk." For the next hour, I let him have it. Every ounce of frustration, resentment, and pain I'd bottled up over the years came pouring out. I reminded him of the nights I worked double shifts while he was God knows where. I told him how his actions had gutted Mom and forced her to carry guilt she didn't deserve. "You didn't just take money, Jake," I said, my voice shaking. "You took trust. You took family. And now you want me to clean up your mess again?" He sat there, head bowed, taking it all in. When I finally ran out of steam, he looked up, his eyes glassy. "I deserve all of that," he said quietly. "I don't have an excuse. I thought I could fix everything on my own, and when I couldn't, I just ran. It was cowardly, and I've regretted it every single day." "Then why didn't you come back sooner?" I demanded. "Because I was ashamed," he admitted. "Every time I thought about calling, I'd talk myself out of it. I thought you and Mom were better off without me. But when the debt collectors started showing up, and I had nowhere else to turn, I realized how badly I'd messed up." His voice cracked, and for a moment, I saw the scared kid he must have been when he first took the money. "I'm not asking you to forget what I did," he continued. I want to make things right, or at least try to." I stared at him, torn between the raw sincerity in his words and the years of damage he'd caused. "Making things right doesn't start with asking for more money, Jake," I said finally. "It starts with owning up to what you've done and doing the hard work to fix it." "I know," he said, nodding slowly, "and I will. Whether you help me or not, I swear I'm going to make things right with you and Mom." For the first time, I believed him, at least a little. But belief wasn't the same as trust, and trust wasn't something I could give freely anymore. The following week was one of the most emotionally taxing of my life. Jake's plea for help and his apparent remorse lingered in my mind, clashing with the anger and hurt I'd carried for years. Part of me wanted to believe he'd changed, that this was his chance to rebuild the bridges he'd burned. But another part of me, the pragmatic part, refused to forget how his actions had devastated me. Mom called a few times to check in. I could hear the hope in her voice every time she mentioned Jake. She wanted me to forgive him, not just for his sake, but for mine too. "Holding on to this anger isn't good for you," she said one evening. "You'll feel lighter if you let it go." Letting it go doesn't mean giving him what he wants, I replied. She sighed, and I could tell she wanted to argue, but she didn't. Just do what feels right, she said softly before hanging up by the weekend. I'd made my decision. I invited Jake over, determined to tell him face to face. When he arrived, he looked even more worn down than before, like the weight of his mistakes was finally catching up to him. We sat down, and I got straight to the point. I've thought about what you said, I began, my tone firm but calm. And I've decided I'm not going to give you money. His face fell, and he opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand to stop him. Let me finish, I said. I can't trust you with money, Jake. Not after what happened. But that doesn't mean I don't want to see you turn your life around. If you're serious about getting better, I'll help you find a job, get into a program for your gambling, or even help you budget to pay off your debts. But I'm not bailing you out. Jake stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mix of disappointment and something else, acceptance. Finally, he nodded. I get it, he said quietly. I don't like it, but I get it. I'm not doing this to punish you, I added. I'm doing it because I want to see you take responsibility for your actions. That's the only way things will ever get better, for you and for us. He nodded again, and for the first time in years, I felt like we were finally speaking as equals. Over the next few months, Jake surprised me. He took my advice and started attending support group meetings for his gambling. Mom pulled some strings with a friend to help him land a job at a warehouse, and though it wasn't glamorous, it was honest work. He even started sending small payments to cover his debts. We weren't magically fixed, far from it. There were still moments of tension, and trust would take time to rebuild. But for the first time in years, I felt like there was a path forward. Jake still had a long way to go, but so did I. Forgiveness wasn't something that came easy, but as Mom had said, holding on to anger only weighed me down. Little by little, I was learning to let it go. Not for Jake's sake, but for mine. And maybe, just maybe, for the family we were trying to piece back together. What would you do in a similar situation? Share your opinion in the comments.